this rhetoric about migration may become so severe that politicians are then too afraid to do anything which looks like they are not on the side of the general population.
The general population isn't reform voters, they are a small minority party. This stuff about hotels, this is the symptom of a backlog in the asylum system and a policy that says asylum seekers are not allowed to work, so they cannot earn money and pay for their own accommodation.
So long as we stick to these laws, we will be under an infinite dictatorship of the neo-populist right.
If everybody says that migration or illegal migration is so important, and we're so worried about the reform narrative or the Trump narrative taking charge, then we got to take the bull by the horns.
It's commonly held among a majority of the British public that most migration into this country is illegal. Now, that is not true.
We need migrants. The problem is that the center and the left in the US and UK don't make the case well enough. I don't know why. Hello, mega orderers. I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Jane Kinnenmont, and this is Disorder.
It's the podcast where, in addition to all the doom and gloom, we try to find a semblance of order in our mad world. And as regular listeners to the show will know, I have long said that Britain has the ability to play an ordering role on the global stage. And I have a little bit of egg on my face in the popular imagination because I was of the belief that when Keir Starmer came to power, he would really up Britain's game domestically with things like house building and the AI economy, but more importantly, internationally, getting Britain to be a top table convener on climate, on Middle East, on NATO, on pooling the allies over Ukraine. And the conventional wisdom is that he has not done those things. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that there has been quite a bit that the UK has done right in the last a la 15 months since Labour and Keir have been in power. But this week, more than ever, it appears that the UK government is in full meltdown, with polling coming out that the majority of Brits feel that Nigel Farage of Reform will be the next Prime Minister, Farage having his own independent foreign policy going to the States. Jane, who do we have on the program to talk about the role of Britain in the world? Can Britain be a mega orderer? Tell us all about it.
I'm delighted today that we are hosting Michael Stevens, who is, among other things, an associate fellow at RUSI, which this podcast proudly partners with, and a senior associate at Global Nation, think and do tank, as well as at RAND Europe. But most importantly, Mike has co-authored a new report with the rather fabulous title of Rules Britannia. So this is after, I don't think we're going to bring ourselves to sing it today, but there is this song, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never, ever, ever shall be slaves. But he's cleverly put that into something to do with the rules-based international order. Please, we're not going to sing, but Mike is also a good friend of mine and a good friend of Jason's. So we argued over who was going to interview him for this show. It nearly came to an arm wrestle, but we decided in the interest of podcast order, we would both come together and meet up with Mike and quiz him about how to fix Britain's foreign policy. And we're really happy, Mike, that you are able to join us. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, guys. Pleasure to be here and to do some mega ordering in this very disordered and complex world.
And apart from the excuse for making use of the amazing pun in your title, what was it that motivated you to write this report about Britain?
So this came out of the product of a few conversations. There really hadn't been a comprehensive, constructive view of Britain's place in the world that reflected the realities of the global order that we see today, and that talked in a constructive manner about how we might best leverage the tools, the capabilities, the strength, the historical role that Britain has played and can still play, to advocate for things that have become a little bit unpopular, I think is probably a word I would say. But if discussed in a proper, mature manner and attached to those historical aspects of Britain's role in the world, which actually gave it leverage, gave it power, gave it the ability to shape the world for good, can actually be beneficial both to the elite foreign policy chattering classes, but also the everyday person on the street.
I mean, you're preaching to the converted here, not only to Jane and I, but to the mega ordering listeners. Britain never would have been the wealthy country leading the charge for the Industrial Revolution and then global free trade, except for its global role, its ability to keep the maritime sea lanes open, to pool capital, to have joint stock companies. Otherwise, it's just a small island off the northwest coast of Europe with not that many natural resources. So, I mean, this is the easiest sell. If the British are receding from their global role, then what do you know? They're not bringing in capital and trading and being a pivot point between the EU and the US, which is what has, from Blair to the present, made the UK wealthy. Otherwise, would go back to the 1970s of being a poorer country than France or Germany or Scandinavia.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we wanted to do with the report was situate it in Britain's history of abiding by the rules, using its long-standing use of common law as an example for everybody out there in the world to kind of look at, emulate. We are seen as a nation of rules and laws. That is in our DNA. It's been there since the late 12th century and developed onwards. And we are very lucky in that there are a number of countries across the world that have copied that system and have used the British legal system as its inspiration. So now we see a world in which a lot of people don't play by the rules. I think it's time that Britain stood there and said, well, hang on a second, these aren't bad things to do. Why is it seen as beneficial to the average person on the street for their leaderships to be basically ignoring the rules, breaking them where they can? The United States has recently used military power to blow up a drug boat coming from Venezuela, and then argue that this was a threat to national security because it was essentially the military weapon of a terrorist organization. It's this sort of remaking the rules as you go along that we say is a really, really great threat to British national interests. And actually, not only is it a threat to national interest, it actually doesn't get you the end results that you want. To actually play by the rules and work with other countries on shared problems results in better outcomes. And that's what we advocate for.
Mike, it seems to me that there's one issue above all where the UK government has really been doing this, and that is over Ukraine, where we've seen quite a strong cross-party consensus. We've seen a public upswell of support to the point where people were offering to take Ukrainian refugees into their own homes, and many of them did. We've seen successive prime ministers essentially say the same thing, that it's necessary to defend another European country against a flagrant invasion and attack on its own borders and sovereignty, and a willingness to challenge the Trump administration on that. So I wonder what that tells us, because it suggests to me that there is a body of support in the UK public for upholding order, at least in some ways, and at least when it seems relatively close to home. But why do you think that that sense of leadership doesn't necessarily translate to a wider set of issues, be that Gaza, be that Iran, be that sort of taking on the issue of the Trump tariffs?
I think there's two things here. One is a kind of national zeitgeist question, which is that the average British person just felt that what happened to Ukraine was really unfair. There's a deep sense that this was not fair. What happened to the Ukrainians was that they were bullied by a much larger state. A casus belli was created out of thin air, and the might of the Russian juggernaut started rolling across into Ukraine very ineffectively, as it turned out. And I think there, and look, I've been a domestic politician myself, and foreign policy rarely cuts through. And I do remember campaigning extensively in 2022, and it came up regularly on doorsteps. This issue cut through.
But to get into the nuts and bolts, you're a policy guy. What are the concrete things that the UK can do to lead the Western military response with a fear that, oh my God, Trump might sell out the Ukrainians? Give us something concrete.
I landed in Florida, just a few miles south of Mar-a-Lago, the day that Zelensky was in the White House, in that infamous disagreement with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. And what was fascinating, apart from the ream of messages that appeared on my phone once I switched it on, was my immediate reaction was, we have to do something. There is no way that the United Kingdom can sit there and watch what's happened in the White House and say that this is not a critical national security threat that we must act on. And it was almost atavistic. And it was very interesting that following week, Jason, talking to Americans and explaining to them what had happened in the White House will produce a response. There is no option for the UK to not look to lead a European response to what had happened, because the trust with the Trump administration was no longer there. So what you've seen, obviously, is this attempt to lead the coalition of the willing. I think it has been partially successful. And the fact that you have Trump oscillating between trying to disengage almost totally from Zelensky's position to then saying, well, actually, Putin's a really difficult guy, and maybe we should continue arms sales to the Ukrainians, albeit with increased caveats, I think is testament to the effectiveness of France, the United Kingdom, Germany, to some extent SecGen of NATO. And I think there already, if you're talking about concrete policy, that is exactly the sort of thing that we advocate for.
How do you go about being a global power on the sort of cheap? I mean, that's kind of a mocking thing to say, but, post-Imperial Britain, which is not in a world where everything is coloured pink like the British Empire was. What's a modern way to be global without having a finger in every pie, because frankly you're slashing budgets all the time?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. You can't have a finger in every pie. You have to pick a few things you really care about.
Really good pies.
And you have to be, that axis around which others revolve. And it's about getting people that feel the same way around you to act in concert with one another. Well, actually, we've seen a little bit of this when it comes to the recognition of Palestine. You've had Australia, you've had Canada, you've had the Japanese, the South Koreans, all starting to speak with one voice on this. And it's quite interesting because the reaction.
But Britain isn't leading. I'm sorry, Britain isn't leading there. Macron said it first, and Keir is being dragged reluctantly to this. So I don't get where you're going at.
I would say that this is a good example of it, actually, because it's one country cannot do this alone, right? And it's about and actually the UK has been quite active behind the scenes with the Gulf Arabs. It's not just France and Saudi Arabia, which is kind of what's set out in public. So I would say that is a good example of getting many countries on the same page. Now, the US can sit there and say, we're the US, we don't really care what you think. I'm not so sure that having 5 of the G7 and 18 of the G20 taking a position on a particular issue is something you want to ignore. The Israelis are not ignoring it, right? The fact that the Israelis keep talking about this shows that they care. Shows that they really feel pushed into a corner on it. But
I think this is an important enough issue that we need to delve in here. But then we're going to move on to issues that, what are the British doing on climate change and the JCPOA. But again, I do not believe that Britain is leading on either the move or the stampede to recognize the Palestinian state or in proposing the post-war solutions in Gaza. It could be doing so. I would like it to not focus on what I see as a complete boondoggle, recognizing a Palestinian state, that there is no Palestinian state on the ground and it doesn't accomplish anything. But if they wanted to have a Jamboree conference in London or in Doha, but sponsored by the British, where billions were pledged for reconstruction, different roles were allocated for, oh, the Saudis are going to do the border between Egypt and Rafah, and the Qataris are going to do the rebuilding of this and getting the hostages. The British could be doing the real concrete things that could get this conflict over the edge. I see them doing absolutely zero of any meaningful substance, and it's embarrassing.
I mean, I would disagree. I think there's been a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of the timing.
We don't need behind the scenes. We need a major jamboree conference that is moving the agenda behind the scenes.
And if you juxtapose that with Ukraine, there have been big jamboree conferences, right? And the UK has been very unapologetic in the way that it does that. Other issues, I think AI has been a very good one where the UK has been convening. You had COP26 and climate change, leadership, where I think the UK was exceptionally good. Actually, it was one of the few things that Boris Johnson did well. I think these days we've been less impactful on that. If you look at the field that I know pretty well, global health, the UK put its hand up and is hosting the Global Fund Replenishment this year. That is the single largest grant-making body in health, I think, in any field on the planet, and the UK is standing up and saying we want to lead from the front on this because we believe fundamentally that it's more important than ever to be thinking about global health problems post-pandemic, right? Where a lot of countries have said this is in the rear-view mirror. We're done with this. Actually, a more secure world is a healthier world. Our argument is very much that yes, the UK needs to look after its neighborhood first, but if you're not talking to players in the global south, you're not talking to your Indias, to your Brazils, to your Argentinas even, right? South Africa, you are not being part of a full conversation in which actually you can play a role in empowering some of these countries to be involved in ad hoc coalitions. It is about making sure that there is an order and an understanding of things, that there's a club of countries that believe in certain things, whether that is free trade, whether that is, just as simple as something like the WTO, right? That is something I think that needs to be adhered to. And a range of countries say, we subscribe to these rules. If you don't, that's your choice, but it will cost you. And the idea of that is not to say to Trump that we think everything you do is wrong, but to say that, have you considered the costs of what you're doing? Maybe you might like to come back and have a discussion about how you integrate a little better with this.
This is an ordering the disordery kind of question, because Britain is not going to be funding and convening on everything: Gaza, Ukraine, climate, vaccines. Give us the one thing that you think that they should be convening on, and what's the actual way it should be done, and what are the economic benefits for your British citizen in Hull or Hove?
Sure. Well, I think that we really need to be having very soon, probably 2026, a conference of middle powers to talk about migration. I think that's a hugely important thing to do. And we actually advocate for this in the paper. And we say in the middle of 2026, the UK needs to be the convener on this issue, with several powers that are facing the same problem, that are looking to have, a solution which deals with, frankly, all of their domestic problems, and come up with grown-up, non-political ways to allocate resources towards the issue. Now, the problem then is, like, where do you stop the train? Do you then try and stop every single war from happening because it creates forced migration? Do you try?
Oh, yeah, let's do that.
If we could.
The success rate would be low, but we should try to do that.
Well, the burden actually is that the vast majority of population movements in the next 30 years will be internal displacement, won't be international. But I just want to come back to this point. If everybody says that migration or illegal migration is so important, and we're so worried about the reform narrative or the Trump narrative or the Front National narrative taking charge, then we got to take the bull by the horns and really start to get this.
Michael, I love it. This has been the issue for more than a decade. When I was writing my Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder book, it was clear to me that the Russians wanted these civil wars in Syria and Libya because they drive migrants to Europe, and that drives Europe to the neo-populist pro-Russian political end of the spectrum. It's so obvious. I want to kick it back to you and Jane, though. So we have this middle power conference. What are some of the solutions? I'm just the talking head. You guys actually do stuff. You have real appointments. Tell me what will be discussed and proposed at this conference.
And who should be at the table? Because Turkey might be one, for example, as one of the world's biggest
100%.
refugee hosting countries. I think one of the problems just now is that the debate in Britain is very focused on what Britain is doing with occasional references to one or two other European countries, but it misses the bigger picture of where are most refugees actually being hosted, where 2/3 of them are hosted in the country next door to the country from which they've fled. And, as you mentioned, internal displacement is a bigger issue still. So I like the idea of the Middle Power Conference that could take a more systemic approach. Who do you think should be at that table?
Well, and here I think you've got to be pragmatic. You've got to be talking to countries that you might not always agree with. And I think one of the things I want to stress here is this is not a global democratic alliance, right? It's not in the era of neoliberalism and values and was it Daniel Keohane and all that sort of stuff. That era has gone. It's about being practical. If, for example, I would be talking to the Saudis. Look at the amount of illegal migration that comes through Yemen, then goes up through Yemen, that comes in from the Horn of Africa, for example. It's a really good example of ways in which you can sit there and you can talk to other countries that are facing genuine problems of mass population movement and say, what have you learned from this? I would have absolutely a country like Pakistan, for example, where they're dealing with huge amounts of migration across the border from Afghanistan. This is all about sharing experiences and knowledge, and it's not just about the Mediterranean basin. Countries have to deal with this, and they're going to keep dealing with it more and more if the world becomes more unstable and it becomes hotter. So let's look at the countries that are affected by them and have them there, I think is the plan. Now, clearly the debate that we're having in the United Kingdom at the moment seems to be mostly focused on 26 miles of English Channel. It's not where the entirety of the problem is. And I think we have to start getting real about looking how to challenge the sources of this instability. Again, I come back to this point. We can't solve Sudan tomorrow. We can't solve Ethiopia tomorrow. It's not our job to stop the conflict in Tigray, for example, as heartbreaking as it was, or what's happening in Darfur. But if you want to mitigate the outcomes, if you want to look at ways in which you can get coalitions of states to kind of secure these areas, actually you might find that $1 billion goes a lot further there than it does in Ukraine, right? So let's have a discussion about resource allocation, which, yes, a Farage could say, why are you spending it over there and not over here? But we're spending it over there so that it doesn't affect here, right? If you don't want your hotel in Epping to be filled with people coming from these countries, then let's have a real and grown-up discussion about it, because otherwise you're dealing with the symptom and not the cause.
Oh, that was one of the sad things, seeing Farage pose with this kind of fake airport sign with all the destinations he wanted to deport people to, and looking at how many of them were places that either the US had bombed or where Western countries had been involved in some active way in a conflict, such as in Syria. And this seems to be kind of missed off the agenda.
I don't know if that's completely a fair framing, Jane, to my ears, because, okay, yeah, the West might be slightly involved in Syria, but there was going to be a civil war there either way. We're not responsible for the fact that the Assad regime brutally suppressed a domestic uprising. You know what I mean?
I think there was a lot of false hope given to opposition groups who were armed and trained by Western countries because they were told by the US Assad must go, and they heard that as the US and UK are going to help overthrow Assad. That was the message that they heard.
I think that's completely unfair. This could be a Syria panel. Obviously, I lived there for 2 years. Michael is a Syria opposition expert. James knows a ton about Syria and has been there. I don't think that's fair. The Libyan and Syrian civil wars are completely domestically driven and had to do with, 4 decades plus in both cases of Arab nationalist, repressive, ideological dictatorships. Whether we help too much in the one and too little in the other, the counterbalance showed that neither worked. The West is absolutely not to blame for the implosion of the Libyan state. Oh, it helped too much, but then not enough in the reconstruction, or the non-implosion and then later implosion in Syria. We didn't help enough. Oh, we promised but didn't help. I mean, the counterpoint there shows these are entirely domestically driven issues that are the product of the global enduring disorder, where we don't live in a world where Russia, China, the various Gulf allies are on the same page. Do you know what I mean? Italy and France being on the opposite sides of the Libyan civil war. Qatar and Saudi having very different policies towards both Syria and Libya. We digress, but you can't blame the West for this migration crisis. What we might blame the West for is having these very namby-pamby asylum laws that were put in place after World War II to deal with completely different circumstances. And these asylum laws act as pull factors that we just haven't reformed the root causes of this absurd pull factor. And I want to toss it back to Michael. Is this Conference of Medium Powers going to say, you know what, these laws drawn up between 1945 and 49 about asylum are over? You get to these shores, you're not getting citizenship, you're not getting a hotel, because the circumstances no longer work, or we're going to have an infinite dominance from Trump to Vance to Howley, from Farage to Badenoch to whoever, because so long as we stick to these laws, we will be under a infinite dictatorship of the neo-populist right.
Let me tell you one thing I am afraid of, and you know, the report is, it's not trying to be highfalutin, it's trying to be practical as best it can. But what I am afraid of is that this rhetoric about migration may become so severe that politicians are then too afraid to do anything which looks like they are not on the side of the general population, right? And therefore we get a conference which just achieves the square root of nothing, because it all becomes about dismantling what existed.
Why would that cause it to achieve nothing? Because if they want to be on the side of the general population, shouldn't they take bold decisions to
yeah, but it needs to be
what do the general population think? Because the general population isn't reform voters, they are a small minority party. What we've seen from recent polling is that based on media coverage and political statements, people have incorrect perceptions about asylum seekers and about illegal migration, where it's commonly held among a majority of the British public, according to YouGov, that most migration into this country is illegal. Now, that is not true.
True.
So you would need to, I think, have a debate that is responsive to public opinion, but you would also need to stop lying to the public. And we have seen politicians, we've seen a Home Secretary at the time stand up in Parliament and lie, saying there's 100 million refugees in the world and let's be clear, they're coming here. Not true. You know, Britain does take a slightly higher proportion of the world's refugees than its own proportion of the world's population. It takes a smaller proportion of the world's refugees than its GDP. So how can we see what is fair? This stuff about hotels, this is the symptom of a backlog in the asylum system and a policy that says asylum seekers are not allowed to work, so they cannot earn money and pay for their own accommodation. That's nothing to do with the Refugee Convention. But the point of having the Refugee Convention is that there is a shared responsibility globally for a shared global problem. And I think there's a false impression right now in Britain that Britain is doing much, much more than its fair share, which just isn't based on evidence. I don't think
the general population cares about whether it's a fair share or not. You're right that the Reform and Badenochs of the world are trafficking in disinformation very effectively, Jane. They manipulate the data and they manipulate the public presentation of it to forward their cause. But do I think that the punter in Epping or Hull cares about, are we doing more than our fair share or less than our fair share? No. They just don't want to be doing it at all, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. I want to go back to Michael's conference. Can it say we as a middle power, by convening Meloni and Macron and the Svenska Demokraten, have decided that we are undoing the entire foundation of the global asylum and refugee system, and I would say if you're not calling for that, you're not dealing with root causes.
Well, I mean, there's the wider debate about the ECHR, but again, I'm conscious of the fact that many of your listeners don't live in Europe and aren't governed by the ECHR. What I would like to see, here we go, let's have a concrete one, is the actual amount of numbers every country is going to commit to every year to take. Let's have that. Let's have.
But you're framing it to humanitarian. That's not what people care about. They want to know.
It's what many people do care about.
No,
what are we basing our reading of public opinion on?
I'm sorry. I mean, we all study this issue. We're not experts on it the way that we are, say, maybe in domestic Arab political issues. What I understand from public polling in the Anglosphere, even including Canada, where they do care more about humanitarian stuff than the US and the UK, that's not what 80% of the electorate care about. They only care about, is this making housing more expensive for me, or are these people performing jobs like in the social care sector that we need? And we just haven't gotten to a place that the migration issue, because we need more migration, Jane, right? The reality is that the US and the UK have a labor shortage. That is just full bloody stop. We have a labor shortage and we need more labor. But what hasn't been done is to solve how does the fact that there are migrants who have skills and there are jobs that need those skills, that hasn't been done. And that has to do with big picture stuff and the rewriting of international law and bold solutions. And I'm interested to know if Michael is going to be like, yeah, we're going to say we need much more migration because we have an NHS crisis. We have so low labor force participation, blah, 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 blah. And that's what I want to hear.
Yeah, that's fine. And I think, by the way, the one thing we haven't talked about is the security aspect of this. Who's going to take responsible for, if this is a collective problem, the Mediterranean, right? Or is it where we're going to simply have the problem that we have right now, which is that you get Spain crying out for more Mediterranean security as it's asked to spend more money in Ukraine, right? And then you get these fissures opening up amongst European powers in what is a continent that is possibly, too small to have these types of fissures. And I would like there to be serious discussion about what that's going to take. If everyone's going to spend more money on defense and security, let's talk about the one thing that everybody really does want to spend on defense and security and be serious about quantifying that in terms of what framework it happens under, who takes responsibility for sea lanes, how they take responsibility for them, what sort of assets you need in place in order to deal with this. That, I think, does deal with public concern because it's a concrete step of doing something whereby everybody is talking about dealing with the same problem together. Now, what it's going to cost, I don't know. I mean, it feels to me that when you securitize an issue, it actually becomes easier to make that case, doesn't it? The problem is, as Jane alluded to, is that you then start to see humans as a problem to be solved and not as humans, which kind of undermines the problem.
No, they're an opportunity for a win-win. We need migrants. The problem is that the center and the left in the US and UK don't make the case well enough. I don't know why, but it's so obvious. The roads need to be rebuilt. The potholes need to be fixed. The social care thing needs to be sorted. We're going to have millions of new jobs that are needed to be done. So is that going to be dealt with at your mega migration conference, which is that we're going to go and set up consulates in every country from Albania to India to Mali and start recruiting people? It's just that you can't come on a small boat. We're going to just say you can come a million ways. You just can't come on a small boat.
If there's need, right? And then if you do come on a small boat, then we've dealt with that question as well. There's, I would like to see some sort of legislation in place. And the thing that does worry me, actually, I'm going to come back to this ECHR question, because you now have very sensible people, Malcolm Rifkind, Jack Straw, David Blunkett, all advocating for walking away from the ECHR. If you're going to do that, there's got to be something else in place. You can't leave a vacuum where it's just a free-for-all, because then you do actually get into real problems between who owns what, who's responsible for what. And look, we can have a very serious debate about whether the post-1945 order has come to an end and whether the kind of legislative frameworks and institutions that reflected that time are anachronistic. But my concern, and one of the reasons I think coming back to why we wrote this report, is just to make sure that there is no gap, right? If you know, and this is a very concrete example of it, because I don't think, or at least I can't recall anybody serious who has proposed an alternative to the ECHR.
But there have been proposals to renegotiate it, and it's interesting to me that this seems to be kind of downplayed or missing from the British debate. Because there's numerous countries in Europe that have suggested that it's time to renegotiate it, and officials involved with the ECHR say that is possible. Renegotiating the Refugee Convention is obviously more complex because of the scale of the convention.
Right.
And I think generally there's a lot of fear about the difficulty of getting a global consensus when on one hand you're going to have rich countries saying maybe we don't want to take as many refugees. On the other hand, you're going to have small island states saying, what about climate displacement? That should be recognised as part of refugeehood. So it's not impossible, but it's complex. The ECHR is a smaller group of countries. There is more scope to look at amending in line with the whole idea that you try to work with what you have rather than walk away and leave nothing in place. And I do think we just need to be a little careful about distinguishing between the refugee issue and the migration issue, because refugees are just a small proportion of total migration.
Do you know what's interesting, guys, is when we were coming up with the idea for this paper and we were thinking a lot about security, a lot about defense, I would say in every single powwow we had and you know, sort of people that we batted the ball back and forward about ideas, I would say a third of every conversation ended up being about migration, which is exactly what's happened on the podcast today. It's really, really interesting that it's a reflection of the time that we're in, where I do want to talk about defense. I do want to talk about collective security challenges. I do want to talk about what we do if Taiwan is invaded or, you know, sovereignty of states is undermined, Greenland being another one.
What I want to hear are actual solutions. Like, so I've been a little bit, to my mind, more bold in putting forth what I think needs to happen. We need more migration, right? Every time this issue comes up on the pod, from episode 1 to now, I always say it. We needed it to be said under the Biden administration. We're going to have consulates in all these places, in Mexico and in Guatemala and Honduras, and there's going to be forms and there's going to be consular officers, and people are going to get the rollout, but they're going to take English language tests. And if you have a master's, boom, you're going to be, you know, we're going to have heuristics. I just don't hear that being said in the British case, right? People are not saying, you know what? We're setting up the British Council thing in India, in Tirana, in Eastern European countries. When you pass these criteria, bam, you're in. And you're going to work from day one, and you're going to this and that. Instead, we're having this moronic conversation about the small boats issue on the exact narrative framework that Kimi Badenoch and Nigel Farage and the moron that I spoke to in Clacton-on-Sea want me to be having this conversation on their wavelength. And I say no. I say we're going to put it forward on another wavelength, which is that we want all these migrants, but we're just going to go out there and we're going to get them and we're going to fuel the economy. And I don't get why that's not the debate, whether it's by Adam Schiff and Gavin Newsom or by Keir and his people. Let's pivot off this. I don't get why we can't control the narrative more. So as we order the disorder, I want to come to you first, Jane. You run the United Nations Organization of the United Kingdom. You proposed the role of the UN as well as other institutions to do global ordering. And I think that all three of us are on the same page about the fact that we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to use existing institutions. Give us a thing that Britain can do, either through the UN or other global institutions, to have a direct impact that will be easily sellable to the British public as beneficial.
So here on the Disordered podcast, we get to control the narrative, which is really, really great. And I think something that the UK could do, given that it has just cut development aid, is that it could lean into championing having a fairer international financial system and making it easier for poorer countries to be less dependent on aid, but better able to thrive when it comes to accessing finance, creating jobs, and developing their own way forward. There are a lot of countries in the global south who would also like to cooperate on something like this. We've had a major UN conference recently on financing for development. Used to be something under the Gordon Brown times that Britain was interested in championing. And it's about essentially giving countries more freedom and more ability to develop their own economies. You could look at addressing some of the debt issues as well as part of that, something that had so much attention around the time of the millennium. And it feeds a shared prosperity agenda that I think a lot of people could sympathise with.
Michael.
I think that's a big topic to take on, especially when you're looking at, the World Bank is going to come under some fierce attack from the Trump administration fairly soon. I'm really interested to see where that goes, by the way, guys, because the MAGA agenda certainly has the World Bank and the IMF in its sights. The vast increase in Chinese multilateral institutionalism at the moment, right? Look at the SCO meetings that have happened recently. China is now actively talking about numbers that it's willing to invest behind these institutions and not just taking pot shots at the United States. So in my view, I think what you are seeing is an increasing world order, which is separated by many multilateral poles. So I come back to my initial point, Jason, which is if the US is going to do its own thing, if the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to take into, its sphere all of the stans and Russia and all the rest of it, fine, let it be so. What we would advocate is that, the middle powers that we would like to see standing up, if they have to create their own multilateral institutions, that's the way it's got to be.
And, that's the way that we have been preaching for more than 2 years on the pod and that I've been writing about for nearly a decade. I want to see a democratic or middle power association, a NATO for the middle powers that's going to deal with climate change and going to deal with health issues and is going to pool together funding. So, of course, it's just the time for it to be made so and for Britain to step up in doing it. Now, we're going to close with a lightning round. We've ordered the disorder enough. Let's talk a little bit of Iran. So, Jane is extremely knowledgeable about the Iran nuclear issue, and we have seen the snapback sanctions under the JCPOA be put into place in the last week and a half. And that's why you saw the Iranian president, Pezeshkian, at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? And you saw them trying to find another way to help Iran out of these snapbacks. So, Jane, explain to the listeners what has happened. What does it mean?
So, snapback is a provision within the JCPOA that was due to expire by the end of October, which is why the E3 have triggered it now. It's the beginning of a 30-day process where if they don't resolve their disputes with Iran, the UN resolutions that were there before the JCPOA all come back into force, which includes comprehensive UN sanctions on Iran. Now, I should stress, nobody actually wants to see that happen. This is not the preferred
outcome the Israelis
of anybody. Nobody involved in the JCPOA or in the UN Security Council wants to see this happen. But yes, I think you are right about that. At least for the current Israeli government. There are others that think there needs to actually be a deal, but that hasn't obviously been the view of the Netanyahu government. Everybody wants in Europe there to be some kind of deal over Iran's nuclear program, which most importantly ascertains the whereabouts of the significant quantity of highly enriched uranium which has gone missing since the Israeli and US bombings of Iran. Probably the best case scenario would be if Iran and the P5+1 could reach an agreement to give themselves another 6 months to talk. That is something that the E3 has put out there. They have said they could extend from this emergency snapback 30-day period to have another 6 months to reach some kind of agreement, because the US and Iran are not ready to reach an agreement. They are not going to get there in the next few days.
But isn't there a fear of giving them that 6-month window?
Yes.
Because they're going to rebuild their missile defense and they're going to learn all the lessons from what has just happened and like, oh, we got to go below the amount that the bunker buster can hit. So, I mean, I am not super keen to be giving the Iranians 6 months right now.
There has been a fear in Europe that if there was a 6-month extension, what if there's another 6-month extension? What if there's another 6-month extension? In fact, it was Iran that refused the 6-month extension because they wanted to bring this process to a head. But the preference of most of the countries involved in the diplomacy is to get a bit more time. I think that if Iran rebuilds its missile defenses, it will make it less vulnerable to being bombed. But let's face it, we have seen Israel and the US bomb it. We've seen the bunker buster being used, and it did not decisively destroy the nuclear program. So it has increased the sense in Europe that there needs to be a diplomatic way out. The Iranians have talked to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has the technical ability to verify nuclear sites, and they are coming back into one of Iran's nuclear facilities, Bushehr, which wasn't bombed. But right now there is a standoff because Iran is saying we are not letting anyone see these bombed sites because they are now high security military targets. That is something that will be a priority
because they're
to
hiding
resolve.
the uranium there, Jane.
Well, this is exactly the issue. This is why you can see why the Iranians are saying this, but at the same time, the rest of the world needs to find out where has this fissile material got to, and that is a higher priority than Iran. Iran will be able to rebuild its missile defenses at some time anyway. And even if UN sanctions come back on, I really worry it will be extremely hard to enforce them because Russia and China are opposed to all of this on
thing, is that
principle.
we lack global order over the situation, right? In other words, it only works like it did under Obama when you have the Russia and China's working with the E3 and America to enforce the whole system. And my hope was that in the wake of the attacks, we would have greater leverage, and the greater leverage of the international community, both over Iran, but also over Israel. In other words, the leverage is over both players, could be used to get to a solution. What say you?
It's troubling that we're at this point, and I've looked at both sides of the argument. I think that the Europeans are right to be skeptical about Iranian explanations. I think that the volume of enriched uranium which built up at the beginning of this year, fine, what happened subsequently with the airstrikes and the offensive missile attacks from Israel and America was not expected, was completely outside the lines of fair and proportionate and possibly illegal, I think is fair to say. But in terms of Iranian activities, it was in clear violation of the JCPOA and has been since 2018, right? They have ramped down observation mechanisms steadily. They have denied inspectors the ability to go to certain sensitive areas of their enrichment facilities. And I think that has, I'm afraid to say, not engendered a lot of trust. But here's the thing, if you're going to talk about snapbacks, you've got to be prepared to go into the room where you use them, even if this is not going to lead to a constructive outcome. And I'm afraid to say at the moment, it's difficult for me to see a way out because Iran has toughened its rhetoric of late. I know the Russians are advocating for an additional 6 months, and that would take us to, Jane, is that March or April? I think it would be.
Yeah, it would be 6 months from the end of October, I believe, when the current JCPOA Security Council resolution would expire.
The problem then is that, we're in the great game at the moment where you do not want to give Russia a diplomatic win. There's also the issue of the rotating chair of the council where Russia comes in October. So there is a rush to get things done. which can lead to miscalculation.
But I think that we shouldn't be so against giving Russia a win that we turn down possible win-win situations, because this is something on which there isn't exact alignment, but there is a little bit of common ground between all of the existing nuclear states that actually still don't want to see nuclear proliferation.
Correct. And look, do we take Russia's word for it? I was thinking through this today because, there is this rush to utilize South Korea as best we can. Well, we've got South Korea on board and we don't have I don't know what the UN version of filibuster tactics are, but it's clear that the Russians would certainly use them once they become the chair. So the question to my mind is, are we trying to maximize the leverage we've got over Iran by basically putting in a really, really punitive window where this could happen in the next few weeks? Or are we looking at some form of de-escalation? My worry is if we look to de-escalate, the 30-ton elephant in the room is the United States and the Israelis. What if they then say, well, do you know what, this is highly insufficient. Once again, we told you this. Iran is breaking rules left, right, and center. The world is weak. We're just going to have to go in again.
The thing is, right now, Trump is kind of washing his hands of it because the official US line is, our bombing was a huge success and the nuclear sites have been obliterated. So there's no desire to say there's any problem to solve, which is quite interesting, even though it is also quite unrealistic. And meanwhile, I think both Israelis and Iranians, many of them will tell you, we believe that there is going to be another war. So there needs to be energy expended now to prevent that war from happening, but there doesn't seem to be much interest in the White House.
Or leverage put on Iran to actually make a deal. Because it should have been that in the wake of this war, because the 12-day war was a success for Israel and the West, that there's just a lot of leverage. We haven't spoken about the fact that one of the Houthi leaders was killed. The Lebanese are actually cracking down using their government against certain Hezbollah assets. Things are moving in Lebanon. The Gaza nightmare, both humanitarianly for people in Gaza as well as for the Palestinian cause globally, has eclipsed from the fact that regionally there is an opportunity to leverage certain military successes in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iran and get some kind of deal. Unfortunately, it would seem to me that neither Netanyahu nor Trump want that. Netanyahu just wants a forever war and he wants to stay in power, because if he actually wanted to leverage some successes, he wouldn't be doing the stuff in Gaza, and he'd be focusing on what he had said heretofore was the real existential issue for Israel, which is this Iranian nuclear program, and he'd have a lot more support globally if he was just focusing on that.
Something Trump could offer is, we're going to keep restraining Israel. We have given you a ceasefire with Israel. We will make sure that lasts. And in return, you give us something. Now, the sticking point that was already a sticking point before the military action was Iran wants respect for its right to enrich uranium, and the US had been fine with that, the JCPOA had been fine with that, and then the goalpost moved and the US said it should be zero enrichment. Right now, this is just a point of pride. What is the point of clinging to this as the hill to die on that is preventing a deal? People are trying to look at ways around that. Could you have a declaration that Iran has the right to enrich uranium, but that it will not invoke that right? It will not enrich uranium voluntarily. Some kind of formula that would allow everybody to save face. But it would still have its opponents in Washington, because any deal with Iran would need to include some kind of assurance for the Iranian regime that it won't be bombed again. And of course, there will be people both in the US and Israel that still think that what should happen is that the regime should be bombed out of existence.
What do you know? Well, we haven't ordered the disorder. I think neither on this issue nor on the issues of Britain's role in the world. It has been a real pleasure chatting with you, Michael. So, if you have enjoyed today's program, please rate us 5 stars in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because we really need those ratings to help people discover our show. If you're interested in Michael's report, which is going to put forth a way that Britain can advocate for the rules-based international order, Rules Britannia. Please follow the link in the show notes to that report and check out our Substack and try to help us by joining the paid Substack so that we can actually fund this program. But we need you to go to the link in the show notes, join the Substack, become a paid member of the Substack, become a mega orderer so that we can advocate for things that Britain and other middle powers can do to help the migrant crisis and to help on climate change and global health. What else do we tell mega orderers, Jane?
You can find us on YouTube, so if you're just listening to us on audio without seeing our beautiful faces, you can look us up on YouTube and subscribe there as well. Hit all the like buttons everywhere. The YouTube thing is quite new and you'll really help us if you can show your love and share that with your friends. Thank you so much for listening and have an orderly week.